professional historian is also trained in historiography. So they know the history of the history writing, right? So a person who's a professional Latter-day Saint historian or historian of the Latter-day Saints knows what the history of the history is. And from that perspective, you you can't answer so simply, well, has the church hidden its past? Has it whitewashed it?
Joseph Fielding Smith tearing out the 1832 account from the letter book, and then decades later, whenever it got leaked to the Tanners, being taped back in, and them seeing this is like, is this not an example of hiding or
Yeah.
being deceptive?
Have there been times um, when church leaders, Joseph Fielding Smith and others, have said, I know that this document exists, but you can't have it? Yes, emphatically, yes. The best hermeneutic is not hostility or suspicion or viciousness, right? Professor Bushman calls the best hermeneutic the hermeneutic of trust.
But they might say that this is coming from a top leader of the church who's almost encouraging religious educators to only emphasize or teach the faith promoting
Yeah.
version of history, not discuss or bring up facts that might harm or challenge faith.
It's more complex than the church hid everything from me. And it's more complex than the church didn't hide anything. You should have done your homework, right?
All
It's
right.
it's the two extremes, blaming everything on everyone but them. That's not ever the accurate version of things.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm very excited for today's interview. I have back joining me again, historian and BYU professor, Steven Harper. Steve, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Good to be with you again.
Yeah, I always enjoy our chats and our conversations. We've done lots of different episodes before. We did a long episode on the first vision a couple of years ago, right at the beginning of my channel, and we've talked about the word of wisdom, understanding changes made to the Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph Smith's revelations. We've talked about the priesthood restoration. And our most recent one was, it's Masonry, wasn't it? Masonry and
Yeah.
the Temple Endowment. We just do too many. And I always appreciate your thoughtfulness and all your insights and your expertise in these things. And I thought, because I've not done an episode yet fully dedicated to the subject about church history, and specifically, has the church hidden or whitewashed its history? And this is a very controversial, it's a big issue, and it's probably not a simple black or white, yes or no. But I thought you'd be someone good to have this conversation with. And in this interview, I've also got questions that I'm going to ask, but also questions from listeners as well, because I think there's a lot of people who have either gone through a faith crisis and left, who have felt that the church is hidden or whitewashed and they feel that betrayal. So maybe just to start off with, like, what would you say in opening to those people who say that the church has taught us a simple narrative of church history and
Mhm.
that they have whitewashed it and that they've intentionally hidden things and thus, they feel betrayed? What would you say that to begin?
Well, what I'd want them to know is that I understand that point of view and empathize with it, and that I would be glad to listen to them and to have a conversation. So I don't think of them as my enemy. I don't think of them necessarily as wrong. I think it's more, I think we could talk about it in ways that are productive rather than destructive of faith.
Hmm.
In other words, me and a lot of other people, professional historians who study this stuff, a professional historian, not just a history buff, they don't just know some facts or a whole lot of facts about some point in the past. A professional historian is also trained in historiography. So they know the history of the history writing, right? So a person who's a professional Latter-day Saint historian or historian of the Latter-day Saints knows what the history of the history is. And from that perspective, you you can't answer so simply, well, has the church hidden its past? Has it whitewashed it? It's not a yes or no answer.
Right.
It's a complicated answer. And that would be true if it were the history of Ireland or the history of the Norman conquest or whatever else.
American
Every
history or
single,
British history. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. Every history has a complicated history or historiography, the writing or the telling of the history. And so, um, you know, a person who is feeling betrayed um, or lied to, one of the things I'd want to invite them to do is to learn the history of the history. My guess is they know a little bit of it or have heard some things about it, but they probably don't know the whole history of the history. None of us do yet. And when you know a lot of that, you're able to contextualize just like anything. You're able to contextualize, you're able to situate it relative to other truth, other history, and it makes sense, makes more sense. It doesn't, when something makes sense, it doesn't mean it's justified. It doesn't mean it's okay. It doesn't mean I won't feel lied to or betrayed, but most likely that feeling of being lied to or betrayed has less to do with the facts about the history of the history than it does about more particular things to that person. In other words, you could have 100 people and they could know the same facts of the matter, and they're not all going to have the same feeling of betrayal or being lied to.
Mm.
So there's something else at work as well, not just the facts of church history that you'd want to take into consideration and account for as well.
Yeah, that's really good. It makes me think of I did a recent interview with Don Bradley, who you would know well, great
Yeah,
researcher and historian. Something that me and Don
fantastic.
both had in common was we both went through a faith crisis and lost our faith and stepped away from church. Don went, completely atheist and removed his name. I didn't remove my name and still held on to a belief in God through most of my time out of the church. But what was interesting, because I wanted to ask him this question because his faith crisis was different to mine. Mine happened soon after my mission, came home at age 21, hadn't really been exposed to too many controversial things in church history, encountered some anti-Mormon sort of critical material, learned that some of these things, which I thought were anti-Mormon lies, there was some basis to them. Some of these things were factual. I then, verified some of them in apologetic source, and I just went down, the rabbit hole, and I felt a lot of betrayal. At that time, I felt like the
Right,
church just taught
right.
me this simple narrative. This was a very faith promoting, whitewash narrative. I felt betrayed, lost my faith. And what was interesting talking with Don, because his loss of faith was a really slow burn over, I think, the period of a decade. And because he'd been going to like church archives and things since he was like a teenager, and he was reading and researching loads of stuff over years. I asked him,
Yeah,
like, did you feel betrayed by the church when you lost your faith? And he said no. And I was like, because most people who leave, they feel very much that the churches lied and deceived them. And he said that he felt like he had done so much research, not just into the history, but understanding that what their likely understanding would have been the history as well, and understanding their time and context. He had a little bit more
right.
charity to them, that it's not as simple as they intentionally hid everything. Is there anything you want to elaborate on that? But I find that a really interesting perspective he had in light of all the research that he'd done.
Yeah, it really is a terrific perspective, and it illustrates the point that I was struggling to make earlier, and that is that a person is um, who's already trained to think about history, meaning not just what happened in the past, but how it has been recorded and told over time, they're not surprised or too shocked or overwhelmed, right? So it doesn't mean they don't have a faith crisis, but it means that their expectations about the past are managed or educated in a different way than somebody who's not ever been exposed to that, right? So Don, who studies the church archives and the church history library, I mean, he's not surprised at the dynamics of how history's been recorded and been told over time. He has a very well-informed expectation of how that process goes. And so he, when his faith, you know, is in crisis or something, it's not because of the same reason that people experience if they're not a historian or haven't had that kind of training or experience. So different nature, the nature of the experience is different. That's a cool comparison you've got access to there, so you can look at what the determining factors are.
Hmm.
In his case, he doesn't feel betrayed because there's no basis to do so. Notice that a person who feels betrayed, they're locating that on the church. Have you noticed that? Sometimes we'll get more specific than that. Sometimes we'll boil it down to Joseph F. or Joseph Fielding Smith or something, but usually it's the church. And then we do a kind of shorthand, they. They didn't tell me this. And you sort of disembody it. It's an abstraction, in other words. Who is the they? Who is responsible to note all the historical facts and make sure everybody knew them, right? You thought so. In other words, when we start thinking about this, it's really a kind of a strange expectation that the church or they will have made sure everybody in the world, or at least in the church, had all these facts. I mean, we're talking about stuff that the leaders of the church have not known for most of the church's history.
Right, right.
Right. Uh, this most of this stuff is relatively new. Um, I don't mean the history is new. I mean the knowledge of the history is relatively new, and we're blaming people for stuff that most Latter-day Saints had no idea about, including most leaders of the church. We've we when we feel betrayed and hurt, we want a scapegoat. We want a person or a thing to locate that blame in. And so we go looking for that. Don knows better than to do that. He knows that it doesn't work that way. It's not what happened. There wasn't some great conspiracy at some point where we said, now let's see, how do we hide the truth from the Latter-day Saints?
Right, because I think like sort of implicit or loaded in that question when people bring up has the church hidden or lied or whitewashed its history, it very much speaks to intent. And I want to get into
Right.
a few specifics, but as I've dived in deeper into history, I'm sure there's among some of the general authorities or the apostles, some of them seem maybe more well versed in church history, like Elder, President Dallin H. Oakes or Jeffrey R. Holland. But I think I tend to agree with you that probably for some, they're not expert historians and wouldn't have known all of these things necessarily in detail. So part of this sort of understanding more about church history with the Joe Smith papers and the gospel topics essays, that they're also probably having to embrace certain things in church history which they themselves may not have necessarily known. So you might feel like, yeah, maybe the church collectively, these things weren't necessarily fully opened up or discussed widely, but were they intentionally hiding it? That makes sense. And I want to get into some specifics that people have questions about, but that's often when people bring up that concern that they've hidden it, it speaks to intent. And I guess, what do you think? Do you think that there is any intentional, like, general wanting to hide things from the members in church history?
I wrote in my book, First Vision, Memory and Mormon Origins, I wrote about the story of the first vision, right? I don't mean the story of what happened in the Grove. I mean the story of what Latter-day Saints knew about the vision and when they knew it and how they knew it. And in that history, there are times when uh, church leaders and church librarians have restricted access to documents they knew existed. There's no doubt about it. So like if the question is, have there been times um, when church leaders, Joseph Fielding Smith and others, have said, I know that this document exists, but you can't have it? Yes, emphatically, yes. Now, that's a fact, and it's not the same as what the fact means. So people need to learn how to discern the difference between facts. In our classes at BYU, we make sure the students have a working definition of a historical fact. That's something that's verifiably true and the same, regardless of how you decide to interpret it or what you believe about it. Okay, so this is material, this is data, intelligence, knowledge that is the same. It's true. It doesn't matter if you're Richard Bushman, a believing biographer, or Dan Vogel, an unbelieving biographer. It's the data that they share in common, that they both know inside and out, right? So it's a fact that, for example, the 1832 history was suppressed. Now, I've read a lot of things from people who seem to know way more about that than the historical records that are available tell, right? There are people who think they know exactly when and what Joseph Fielding Smith did with that and why and so forth. Man, I've been looking for that information for a long time and haven't found it. But there are plenty of documents that show that he knew it existed and that he limited very much the access to it.
Mm.
He even wrote letters to people about that, about his intentions. And I believe Hugh Nibley similarly had access briefly to the Alexander Niebuhr account of the first vision, and then didn't have access to it later. And he's on record saying, yeah, it should be restricted. And I'm glad it is. So it is the case that um, access to information has been restricted. Now, I'm trying to say that nonchalantly because I want people to learn the difference between that fact and the way that they endow the facts with meaning. Depending on people's biases, prejudices, vulnerabilities, depending on all kinds of subjective factors, we endow historical facts with meaning that's not inherent in the facts themselves. In other words, if you were to say Joseph F. Smith wrote to Georgia Tanner that she could not have access to the earliest first vision account, therefore the Church of Jesus Christ is not the restored Church of Jesus Christ on the earth. That's a non sequitur. It's an argument that doesn't follow.
Right, right. Because
You've endowed it
there's one
with
listener
meaning
who
that's not there.
yeah, who was asking that question about, Joseph Fielding Smith. So since we're on that, bringing up the question about the 1832 account, Joseph Fielding Smith, tearing it out, or one of his assistants from the church
Yeah.
tearing out the 1832 account from the letter book, and then decades later, whenever it got leaked to the Tanners, being taped back in, and them seeing this is like, is this not an example of hiding or
Yeah.
being deceptive? And as you said, when the Tanners were asking to see it, being told no. What are your thoughts on that? Obviously, we don't know people's motives, but you want to try to extend
Yeah.
some grace or charity.
Yeah. So when it comes to interpreting the historical evidence, we choose a hermeneutic. We choose a theory or a method or a philosophy, a principle or set of principles by which we will interpret. And all of us, our hermeneutic is informed by bias, by our biases. And if anyone who denies that is just biased exponentially because they don't recognize or acknowledge their bias. Okay, so the best thing to do is to educate your biases, is to fill them so full of evidence and knowing that you've got them, that your biases are tempered and so forth. All right, so the best hermeneutic is not hostility or suspicion or viciousness. Right? Professor Bushman calls the best hermeneutic the hermeneutic of trust. He's he's as accomplished as a historian as a person can be, and he built his career on taking people at face value. That doesn't mean he believes everything everyone ever says. It means that he starts from a position of trust. He doesn't decide beforehand that they're lying to me and I have to expose their lies, right? History is not a conspiracy theory that he's got to figure out, right? And I wrote a book, my first one, right, about colonial Pennsylvania and so forth, and it is about a conspiracy against Native Americans. So I'm not trying to advocate for being gullible or blind, having blind faith. Not at all. I'm trying to encourage a historical method that is rigorous and robust, but that minimizes bias. Okay. So if I am convinced that the church hid its history from me, and that's how I'm going to read everything, then I'm biased already. There's no chance I'm going to see things as they really are and really were. But if I'm open to the possibility that all kinds of decisions have been made, and it's not like a universal one way of thinking throughout all time. Rather, it's a roller coaster ride through history with all kinds of factors and variables and contingencies, right? That's going to give me a much more accurate view of things. And I really liked what you said about grace. It's possible to know the facts of church history and then so I'm a historian, right? I'm a historian by training and by personality. I believe that I should have access to everybody's personal records. That's just comes with being a historian. I think everybody owes me their most intimate, detailed personal records. Okay, so that's my bias. So anybody who is suppressing information, I don't like that. I want access to all the information. Now, I can have that point of view. It's subjective to me, certainly. I'm not saying it's an objective reality. It's subjective. I can have that point of view and still recognize that Joseph Fielding Smith is doing what makes the most sense to him and what is wisest and best, right? And so I sometimes try to make this point by trying to help people understand that Joseph Fielding Smith is the son of Joseph F. Everybody knows that, but I'm not sure they grasp the significance. Joseph F. is a 5-year-old boy when his father was shot to death through his face. And Joseph F. Smith sees and smells that corpse of his father. And he knows very well that the people who did the murder of his father were tried and the jury nullified the verdict. The jury found them innocent, even though everyone knew they were guilty. He was driven from his country. He was persecuted and prosecuted. And when that's your heritage, you have a defensive posture, right? You are defensive against anybody who is aiming their weapons at your faith. Well, if you're Joseph Fielding Smith, you come of age with that in the air you breathe. And when it becomes your turn to be the official keeper of the sacred records, you do your very, very best to make sure they don't fall into the hands of people who would weaponize them against you. Now, is that a right thing to do, a good thing to do, etc.? I don't think so. I mean, I'm a historian. I deserve all the access in the world
Right.
to everybody's sacred records.
Yeah, you're very
So
much in favor of full transparency to all the
sure.
documents.
Yeah, except for when it comes to me. I'm not giving the whole world my sacred records. I'm not giving my intimate secrets out. I guess that is the culture we live in, right? Everybody gives their intimate secrets out on social media, it seems like.
Hmm.
But so what I'm trying to say is it's possible, and in fact, it's wise to embody different points of view. A good historian will understand all of the various points of view that are in play. And they will appreciate them. It doesn't mean they'll agree with them, doesn't mean they'll advocate them. It just means they'll appreciate them. It makes good sense why Joseph Fielding Smith would do what he did, given his literal positions, his callings and assignments in the church, and also his personality and his heritage, his upbringing, his vulnerabilities. In other words, you put any of us in the same situation, in the same circumstances, and we do the same thing. So there's a fair amount of hypocrisy, or at least naivete, when we criticize people from the past for behaving in the same ways we would do if we were in their shoes, right? We try to find fault with them instead of understanding them on their own terms. And Professor Bushman understands people on their own terms. It doesn't mean he agrees with everything they do or whatever else. The best historians all do this. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich does this brilliantly. Many historians do it. But for someone who's not as well trained and or not as inclined to the hermeneutic of trust or charitable readings of people, there are reasons to intentionally aim your weapons at Joseph Fielding Smith or whoever else and find all the fault you can with them. Right?
Right.
You can certainly do that if that's what you want to do, but it's not the best way to do history. It's not the best way to understand what really happened and why it really happened.
And I suppose that, like, in a way, like, even if you grant that that is what happened and that is what Joseph Fielding Smith did, and he did intentionally hide it, doesn't therefore disprove the first vision or that it really happened. You could
No,
say maybe he found it troubling in a way, or he didn't feel like he wanted it to be published, but it doesn't therefore disprove it. But that would be one act in church history that I personally feel like, yeah, I don't know if I fully agree with it, how it was handled, but also I can extend maybe some grace or the benefit of the doubt. For example, my mother, who is an absolute saint, she passed away a few years ago, but a really active, faithful member of the church, and um, she had such a good heart. But whenever she was asked by my sister about the temple endowment, that there used to be sort of oaths or symbolic penalties that you would take in the temple, she denied it. And somebody could say, your mother, she lied, she was a liar. And I know my mum that she would have been doing it, one, to either protect faith, or she didn't know what she could say. And you know, extending some grace, even if Juice Fielding Smith did do that, I could understand that maybe he did it because he didn't want it to impact faith, I guess. And sort of linking to this, another thing people often bring up about, top leadership not wanting to be fully open about, say, maybe controversial aspects of our history is a talk that was given by President Boyd K. Packer. I believe it was to religious educators. The mantle is far greater than the intellect,
yeah,
and this is just one aspect of the talk. But people bring up that he sort of encouraged to maybe just emphasize the very faith promoting aspects of our history, and that not all facts are useful, and that the truth doesn't always uplift or edify, which is true. Not all aspects of history or church history is uplifting or edifying. But they might say that this is coming from a top leader of the church who's almost encouraging religious educators to only emphasize or teach the faith promoting
yeah.
version of history, not discuss or bring up facts that might harm or challenge faith and might find that problematic. What's your thoughts on that?
That's all true. It's true that President Packer said those things and believed those things and taught those things. And I do too, to a degree. Now, I mean, I got to balance that with the part of me that believes that I should have access to everyone's most intimate personal records. So I live in a time and a place and have a personality that advocates a much more openness, right? The truth. I'm not afraid of the truth.
Hmm.
And so um, I, I don't think there's a reason to suppress the records sometimes in the way that some of our leaders and many of our members have felt, right? So I understand, in other words, what he's saying. I empathize in a large measure with what he's
Yeah,
saying. If I wanted to, and if you wanted to, you could use history as a weapon or a pseudo history, right? You could do a pretty compelling um, lesson in a Sunday school class or in a fireside or a guest lesson in seminary, and you could leave people pretty devastated, right? You could take vulnerable people, you could use your knowledge and skills, and you could wreak havoc on faith. Well, what President Packer is advocating is that you don't do that, right? If you're in a position of power, don't exercise your power as a weapon against someone else's faith. Well, critics of that will say, well, then you're not interested in the truth. Aren't you an apostle? Shouldn't you be interested in the truth above all? And I don't know for sure what President Packer might say to that, but he would, I think, say something like, yeah, I'm interested in the truth. And I'm interested in lots of things sort of balanced together in the right proportions and delivered in the right, time. It's a little bit, he might say, like a vaccine, right? You can give someone a dose of a disease that's lethal, or you can give someone a dose that will inoculate them against the lethal aspects of it. And you can bring along their abilities to be immune and resilient by exposing them to the same kinds of things. He's not saying never tell the truth to anybody. He's advocating a kind of measured truth telling and balancing, um, and not just using your knowledge of historical facts as weapons against people's faith. So again, it's nuanced and it's layered and it's complicated. And if
sure.
you wanted to, you could pick and choose from what Elder Packer taught. And if you want to, you can try to understand him on his own terms, not necessarily agree with everything he ever said or thought,
Right,
but
yeah.
understand why he would say it and
Yeah,
appreciate what he's trying to accomplish.
yeah, because me and my wife, we sort of had a conversation about, those statements and that talk. And on the one hand, I feel like, my approach on my channel is one of like, we need to discuss all the facts. We need to try to be fully open and transparent, whether or not it's faith promoting or even challenging. We need to be informed. We need to grapple with it. So maybe I wouldn't fully agree with some of his sentiments, but I can appreciate where I understand fully where he's coming from. And in a way, like, he's wanting to protect faith and build faith. And as you said, as religious educators, there is that responsibility as well. And I think I learned a little bit of that for myself for the first time whenever I was called as a Sunday school teacher, teaching
Yeah,
12 to 13-year-olds. And I introduced them to maybe some things if it tied in with the lesson. Like we talked about Book of Mormon translation, and I mentioned the two different instruments used, the Urim and Thummim and the seer stone, because I thought it was
fantastic.
relevant and thought it was good to inform them. And then there was one lesson, and it was the lesson where in one of the chapters it talks about the Lamanite curse. And I think Scripture Central around that time had put out a video on it. I brought on Brent Gardner to discuss the different explanations or theories, and it's a controversial topic.
Yeah,
And I felt like this needs to be discussed. We need to be transparent about it. And I felt like my channel was a great way to discuss it with Brent. And I just didn't feel like it was right for me to bring it up to focus on that when there were so many other important aspects in the lesson to talk about that would help them spiritually. Like if I
mhm,
just brought that up, it would just cause confusion. It would distract. It would be very controversial. And what would be my intention behind doing it? And that was the first time where I realized that I didn't feel in that setting teaching those 12, 13-year-olds that was the appropriate thing to do. So I
that's
can
right.
understand wanting to teach a faith promoting version. But at the same time, part of me also feels that when should, we talk about these controversial things? Is a Sunday school lesson appropriate? A sacrament meeting talk, a seminary lesson? Because at some point you wouldn't want them to get to 40, 50, 60 years old
That's
and
right.
then and then think about it. Um, but I think from that experience, a little bit more grace to where, say, maybe President Boyd K. Packer is coming from. Even if I don't fully agree with it, I can appreciate and extend some grace for that his heart would be in the right place.
That's a mature and informed way of thinking about this whole thing, right? If my motive was to just hang Elder Packer, right? I could do that. I could be selective in what I picked and chose from what he ever said and taught. And I could come from a position where I overemphasize truth telling and I underemphasize the wisdom of, you know, education and how to build people up educationally and in every other way, right? I could pick and choose and I could make him look like the villain. I would be doing this in a way that made myself look like the hero, right? I'm Captain Truth and
Yeah.
I'm opposed to the evildoer Boyd K. Packer, who was opposed to the truth. I'm just flipping the narrative if I do that. I'm just making myself the apostle and him the apostate, and that's not true. That's not real. That's not transparent. That's just a naive and a misinformed way of sort of flipping the script that really isn't motivated by wanting to know all the truth. It's motivated by wanting to be on a side, right? To pick a side. And you'll notice that the very most informed people about this don't have that personality. They don't act like that. Again, I think of the best historians I've ever learned from: Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, Richard Lyman Bushman, Kathleen Flake, others, right? Not necessarily Latter-day Saints as well. Lori Maffley Kipp is like this, right? She doesn't grind axes. She doesn't need to, you know, play gotcha with anything. John Turner is extraordinarily uh, learned and gifted as a historian. Doesn't believe in the restoration of the gospel as a divine thing, or at least not in the same way that Latter-day Saints do, but also doesn't have that need to, right, to harm Latter-day
Mm.
Saints and their faith in the process. So those are the people who know best how to evaluate historical source material and interpret it wisely and in the context, the wider context in which it fits. So those are the people and their hermeneutic, their way of thinking about interpretation that I would recommend to people. They're not the
Yeah.
ones who are the loudest mouths on the internet trying to bring down the restored gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. I think your own motives and intent can matter as well. Are you just bringing up some of these controversial things in order to stir
Yeah,
controversy or to plant doubt? But at the same time, you're definitely in favor, and I'm sure in your classes that we need to bring up some of these challenging things as well to inform people to make them aware and to have more
yeah,
understanding of the complexity and to contextualize things as well.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is what I do every day, right? I teach a class on the foundations of the restoration, and we take up every single one of these issues, right, that
Yeah.
relate to the history of the church, and we take them up in turn. We don't pretend they don't exist. We don't shy away from them. We don't. Um, I don't think in terms of faith promoting history or real history. Those are the same thing for me,
Mm.
right? I don't even understand that distinction. The real history of the Book of Mormon is incredibly faith promoting. The real history of Joseph Smith is incredibly faith promoting to me. In fact, the real history of the race restriction on priesthood ordination and so forth is a tough one, and ultimately faith promoting to me.
I've been reading a book on that
Faith promoting,
recently with Paul Reeves,
yeah,
and I've listened to the Church History Matter series on, and
yeah,
it's a tough history. It's complex, but I find it at least I've had more understanding of the
yeah,
context as well that maybe I didn't have beforehand, which
right,
doesn't justify everything that was said or done
not at
by
all.
Brigham Young or other leaders, but you can understand more of what's going on in a way.
Yeah, that's what a great historian does. And Paul Reeve is a great historian
Yeah,
of that, and everything he puts his hand to is he's in that same league, right? With the very finest minds to study the past. And you don't find them playing gotcha, and you don't find them taking a one-sided view. Brigham Young is complex, as Paul Reeve uncovers him and presents him to us, and there's some just heart-wrenching, um, sad, terrible things in what Brigham Young teaches relative to race.
yeah,
And Paul Reeve has no problem, presenting that truth to the world, but also situating it relative to the rest of the things that we know and learn, instead of just giving us narrow views that are designed to win an argument. He wants to tell the truth, and the truth is a person can decide faith promoting or faith demoting. We sometimes act and talk as if there are facts that are full of faith and facts that are not full of faith, and we just pick the facts that are faith promoting and not the ones that aren't. That's really not the case, right? Faith promoting is a subjective decision, right? Tell
kind of how
only
you choose
faith.
to interpret it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't like the idea that you could tell just faith promoting history or faith uh, demoting or undermining history. There's nobody who could come up. You couldn't get a group of people together and have them all agree on what that is.
Mm,
Faith is a subjective thing. What might promote one person's faith would undermine another person's faith. So, what we need to know are what are the facts, the information that's true and verifiable, regardless of how we decide to think of it in terms of faith. And then we decide, what do I think about this in terms of faith, right? My faith is a subjective judgment. It says much more about the internal mechanisms of me, my soul, than it does about objective data. That's
yeah.
why you can have people who know the same facts and have entirely different experiences of faith or lack thereof with regard to those things.
Right, coming to different conclusions. There's so many thoughts and so many different things that avenues I want to go down. But I want to go to this question next because I have some listener questions and I want to make sure I go through as many as I can. So like the church I think has a lots of really good resources now. You're involved as an editor in the Saints volumes. I think they're a good history. We have the gospel topics essays that came out over a decade ago that are essays that address some of these controversial things. And if you want to dive deeper, there's other sources you can go to. The Joe Smith Papers project, which you've worked for that as well as an editor for the Joe Smith Papers project. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. And even, the church has different like gospel topics. And, I've read some on whenever I've done, videos on different topics like the 1826 Glasgow trial or
Mhm.
Masonry and the endowment. They're quite short, but I think they're quite good summaries. And I'm like, man, it's really there's so much on here now. And I think those are some really good steps that I feel like today there's so many resources now to learn about these things, and then things outside the church. You've got like Scripture Central and Church History Matters are doing great stuff as well. And I think
Yeah.
David Snell's Faith and Beliefs are a good resource. So there's way more resources now.
Yeah.
But I
I
want to ask
agree.
this question that people will say that the reason that we have Saints and the Jew Smith Papers Project and the Gospel Topics essays is because of the internet, is because of the critics and so many people losing their faith. And the church for so long, they just didn't want to open up about these controversial things in church history. And now it's because of the critics that now they're being transparent about the history. And like one listener says, why did it take so long to publish the gospel topics essays if prophets from 50 years ago were really prophets and seers? They should have seen around the corners. And then another
Ah,
listener said, they taught us a very simplistic, contrived narrative. If it had not been for the internet and the information age, they would still be happily teaching us the same old story. They only
yeah,
changed, accepted the truth because they had no choice. So, kind of in a nutshell, they're saying that because of the internet, because of people leaving
sure.
the church, Not we were taught a simple narrative, and only now because they've had to have they become open and transparent. What's your thoughts on that?
So I want to uh, pay particular attention to the way that statement was phrased a minute ago. It was a good example of what I call hypothetical history. It was itself an act of prophecy, right? If, right? It started with the word if. Could you read it again?
Oh yeah, if prophets from oh why did it take so long to publish the gospel topics essays? If prophets from 50 years ago were really prophets and seers, shouldn't they
Mm.
have seen around corners?
Yeah. So if they were, they should have seen around corners. So this statement, which seems so airtight, so you know, flawless in its reasoning, is is a disaster of it's a cognitive distortion, right? So first of all, it assumes a definition of prophets and seers. We would have to do a lot of work to come to an agreement on what a prophet and seer is. This person assumes that a prophet and a seer is someone who can tell 50 years in advance what implications the internet will have and will see around that corner, and who will put measures in place to avoid that ever happening. So in this case, a prophet and a seer is someone who prevents you, Stephen, from ever having a faith crisis because they circumvent that somehow, right? They see around the corner and they take away the contingencies that led to that, or to whatever else, right? So this hypothetical history is a game that you can play no matter what, right? If it's all based on imagination, we're not dealing in any facts here. We're not dealing in anything hard, any evidence based. We're just using our imagination. Our imagination says prophets, in my imagination, prevent anybody from losing their faith by making sure they know all the history in a sophisticated way before they could ever be blindsided by historical data available on the internet. And if that doesn't happen, then they're not true prophets. That is a measuring stick that that person made up.
Hmm.
There's no revealed definition or scriptural one or prophetic one that tells us that's what a prophet and seer is and what they do. So if that's the way I get to decide, then I will just move the target, and I'll always be able to say that the prophets and seers are not prophets and seers. They'll never match my definition, my subjective moving target definition. That's why it's hypothetical. If this, then the outcome would have been different than what the outcome is. So because the outcome is what it is, then the prophets are not prophets after all. That
I guess
seems, in
there's
other words,
assumptions and
yeah,
expectations
my gosh,
embedded
it's
into that
it's
statement.
freighted with assumptions that are not identified and interrogated. They're just stated as if it was absolute truth. It's not absolute truth. You have to slow down. You have to slow way down and begin by asking, what is a prophet? What's a seer? What does it even mean to see around corners? I know the book, right, by that title. I'm not sure. There's some good points in it. And then there's a whole bunch of unanswered questions that it leaves. Um, even if it's true that prophets see around corners, does that mean that because we have prophets, there are never any negative consequences? Right? Does seeing around corners mean they reverse the effects of any contingencies, or they change any plans so that you and I never have trouble or never have a crisis of faith or whatever? It's no. So it's just I hope that the folks who think that way will catch themselves in their fast thinking, and they'll slow their minds down. They'll identify their assumptions, interrogate their assumptions, identify the cognitive distortions that they're introducing in their thinking. All or nothing is one of the most common ones, right? Black and white, um, emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is a very common cognitive distortion for people who are so invested in this, in their faith, as you've mentioned. So these criticisms that seem so sound are actually really um, they're on sandy foundation.
And your thoughts on sort of the second part of the question that was sort of getting at that, the Saints and Joseph Smith Papers Project and the Gospel Topics
Mm,
essay. Like, I certainly think
right.
they're certainly
Yes.
influenced by the internet and people leaving
Yes.
the church.
No
That's
doubt.
no doubt. But what would you say that the church is only being transparent because they've been forced to, because of the internet and so many people losing their faith?
Okay, I don't know if that argument is sound or not. I don't have all the data to
Hmm.
know, right? But let's grant, for purposes of a thought exercise, let's grant that it is. Let's say that let's make an argument formally. So the premise is the internet, and the result, really what we mean is the near universal access to information that half a century ago was not accessible,
Right.
has led to a dramatic rise in dissonance, right? People having this feeling that what I believed and what I now know is not the same thing. So there's a gap between those two. And that has led to a lot of tensions and dissent from church, etc. Okay, so access to information has led to this dissension, tension, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, the church has decided finally that we have to tell the truth about our past. Okay. Therefore, let's add one more premise. Therefore, the Church of Jesus Christ is not, in fact, Jesus Christ Church. Even if every single one of those premises were, the first three were sound, the fourth one does not follow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So the person asking this argument is assuming they're reading meaning into the premise that the church is only doing a reactionary measure here, right? We should have done a proactive bunch of stuff, and that would have saved people's faith, and that would have made sure we didn't have faith crisis and so on. And if we had just done that, it would be the true church. Is that the argument that's being made? It's something like that.
Hmm.
Why would we think that's a sound argument? We'd have to figure out if that is a sound argument. There's a whole lot of theology and philosophy and a massive amount of assumption going on in these arguments that they seem like they're airtight to people, but they're not. They we've got to slow down and take apart every single premise that we're asking. And we're really not interested in truth ourselves if we're not willing to do that work,
Hmm.
right? If all we want is an easy way to excuse myself from commitment to the church, or maybe what we're looking for is um, a bit of salve for the woundedness we feel that we were blindsided by stuff, right? Whatever it is, our motive, um, if it's any less than wanting to know what the truth is, regardless of what it is, just truth for its own sake, a person who wants truth for its own sake is not satisfied with assumptions masquerading as truth. They're not satisfied with cognitive distortions. They peel back all those layers and they find out if, in fact, their premises are true. And if you could have two true premises followed by a false one, and your argument doesn't work. Or in the case we saw, you could have three that are true, and then you could decide that it means X, and X does not follow. It's not true. So I guess I'm sorry to go on so long and to be so perturbed by it, but it makes me frustrated when we don't think well about things of eternal consequence. Joseph Smith, in one of his vision accounts, his 1835 journal entry, said, I considered it of the first importance that I should be right in matters that involve eternal consequences. I consider it of the first importance that I should be right in matters that involve eternal consequences, that I am terribly discontent anytime me or someone else makes a shallow or flawed case or bases it on assumptions instead of actual knowledge.
Yeah, because I think
What,
your point, you know, earlier when we talked about Joseph Fielding Smith, and let's just say, even if you view that he intentionally, hid the 1832 account for decades, that in my mind does that act alone, whether or not I think it was right or wrong, does not disprove Joseph Smith's first vision, or even if he
oh,
was troubled, let's just say he was troubled by the
right.
1832 account, that that does not then disprove the first vision for me.
Yeah.
That is so I think that's the point where even if you feel like there has been things hidden or the church hasn't been fully forthright, that does therefore not mean the church
Yeah.
is not true. I can understand why people might feel disturbed if they look at it like that. And I think as well, I think likely that certainly must have been an influence is people losing their faith, leaving the
Yeah.
church. There's more awareness of this as well. And I remember Elder Ballard once, I can't remember where he was uh, who was talking to or where this was, but he basically said, like, gone are the days when it comes to things with church history that we can just bear our
Yeah.
testimony or say, don't worry about those questions. That we need to be, really well informed, well trained. We need to provide answers to people. I remember he said as well, like, as a general authority, as an apostle, if I have questions, I have to go to an expert to find answers. And that was kind of eye opening to me. Like, even though they're general authorities and apostles, and we believe they have that special calling and can receive revelation for the church, they also need to turn to historians or experts on certain topics as well, because they may be encountering questions or may not have full understanding on something as well. And that
Yeah.
was a realization to me that the expectations of prophets as well, and that they may not as well have known all the things that we now know uh,
That's for
about
sure.
about
Yeah.
church history. Because I think there's this tension because on the one hand there's some people who feel I've heard some apologists say whenever I was sort of in disillusion with the church, this kind of bugged me when they say no, the church has been fully transparent and was your fault. You were lazy, you
Yeah.
didn't read. And then they would say and we should not acknowledge this, maybe with the seer stone there's been a few ensign articles in the last few decades that have mentioned it, or other certain things that have been mentioned. So they would say, oh, it was your fault, the church has been fully transparent, and I don't think that's really fair, because I think for the vast majority of people who were attending church and active and reading the scriptures and going to either seminary institute or Sunday school and reading lots of gospel books, for them that was maybe they first encountered
Yeah.
some of these things maybe with the essays or critical resources. So I don't think it's fair to say that, but then it's also an extreme to say that everything's been completely hidden and completely whitewashed. And the
Yeah.
question I was going to bring up, I think there's this tension between how much responsibility lies on the church as an institution in its correlated curriculum in seminary and institute to try to present as accurate and as forthright a history, and then the tension between the responsibility on the individual as well to study and to seek as well. I feel like it shouldn't just be totally on the individual. I think the church has a responsibility as well in some degree, but then it can't just be fully on, depending on the church and, your church attendance on Sunday, your Sunday school lessons or seminary to learn all these things. So, what's your thoughts on that sort of tension, that balance between your responsibility and
Yeah.
the church's responsibility?
I think what you just said is really wise and well informed. It's more complex than the church hid everything from me. And it's more complex than the church didn't hide anything. You should have done your homework, right?
All
It's
right.
it's the two extremes, blaming everything on everyone but them. That's not ever the accurate version of things. And I think you're exactly right also that the responsibility for the the gathering of the preservation of and the keeping and the sharing of sacred knowledge, it rests with the institution and with the members of it, right? The day the church was organized, the Lord gave a revelation and it said, let there be a record kept among you. And Joseph in it makes sure that it's documented that you are a seer, a translator, a revelator, a prophet, an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. And the Lord reiterated that command several times, including the command, keep the church history continually for the good of the rising generations, right? The church is obligated to keep its history, the historical materials, and provide accurate history of itself for its upcoming members who didn't live it, right? We saw in the Book of Mormon what happens when you lose your knowledge of who you are and where you come from. You lose your identity. You lose eventually your sense as children of God, and certainly as covenant people of God. And unless you enlarge the memory of this people, unless you provide the sacred memory, and it has to be true if it's going to be sacred and do its work, then you're going to lose the rising generation. They won't belong anymore to the covenant, to God in a certain sense. Biologically, sure, you could be a descendant of pioneers and in some sense a child of God, but you lose your those sacred identities that President Nelson has been teaching us about. So it's true that as the Come Follow Me curriculum emphasizes, and as President Nelson has emphatically emphasized, you are responsible for your own testimony. Own your own testimony. Don't leave to anyone else the responsibility of nurturing your faith in and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ and his restored gospel. And at the very same time that is true, it's the responsibility of the church to provide the resources that can make that happen. It's not one or the other, it's
Yeah.
both. Doing their divinely given jobs and responsibilities that will lead to the greatest result.
Yeah, I think I'm on the same wavelength as you, and I have a lot of empathy and understanding to those people who again have feel that betrayal. Like I'll share with you like a little
Yep.
anecdote. My experience growing up in the church, I had, a strong spiritual testimony gained at age 14, reading, preach my gospel, reading about the restoration and the plan of salvation, and studying the atonement of Jesus Christ. I then was reading the Book of Mormon and other scriptures. Then I was doing seminary and I was reading like gospel principles manuals and then institute manuals, seminary manuals. And I wouldn't say I was like a huge reader, but then I was reading through like things like Mormon doctrine. And I think as a youth, I think I was very interested in the
Yeah.
gospel and doctrine, maybe more so than maybe some of my peers, shall we say. And then I
More than I
went
was.
and then I went on my mission, and I was a little bit restricted in what you could read. It was the scriptures, and then we had like Jesus the Christ and Our Heritage, which is a church history book which I read,
Yeah.
and True to the Faith. And but there was only certain books that we could read. But I was reading a lot, and I was really into the church, into the gospel, and I had never gone looking for anything critical or anti-Mormon because we're counseled not to. And I probably was aware of maybe a few things in church history. Obviously, I was aware of the priesthood ban, and that there was a revelation in 1978 because that's in the scriptures. I had read Doctrine and Covenants 132. I think I'd heard my family talk about Joe Smith's polygamy, but I wasn't really too interested to dive in. That could have been an opportunity to maybe have learned more about it. Um, I was aware from watching the movie God's Army, he brought up there's different First Vision accounts, but I hadn't read them or I wasn't aware of any controversies. But I remember on my mission, for example, encountering a couple of people that were quite antagonistic and mocking and brought up, Joe Smith used a rock and a hat to translate the Book of Mormon, or he was, a polygamist and married other men's wives. And I remember feeling like you don't know what you're talking about. Like I've grown up in the church. I'm a missionary. I think I
Yeah.
know more about my church than what you do, you crazy loon, and very much dismissed it. And then whenever I came home from a mission and I had a sister who left the church, and my first encounter with critical information was because I wanted to help bring her back. I wanted to
Yeah.
be like a good member missionary. and to sincerely understand her concerns. And then she started sharing with me some of her concerns. And my initial reaction, like she said to me, Joseph Smith drank wine in Carthage jail. I'm like, what? I'm like, no, he didn't. Like that's an anti-Mormon lie. Where's your source for that? And then she showed me a source in the history of the church, and I was like,
His
oh,
history. Yeah.
yeah. I was like, and he said, I think it was it John Taylor that wrote it, and it was like, not for sacrament, but to boost our spirits. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh dang. And then she showed me like a podcast by Grant Palmer, talking about like the seer stone and polygamy and other topics. And then what was really disheartening for me, and I think this is where I felt some betrayal, was whenever I hadn't gone looking for anything anti-Mormon or critical, whenever I'd heard some criticisms as a missionary, I just dismissed it. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. I know my religion. And then whenever I was encountering these critical podcasts and then went and saw some of it being verified in like the gospel topics essays, I went to
Right.
Fair
Right.
Mormon. That was really hard for me
Yeah.
because I felt, as many people did, I was faithful. I was reading everything that I could sort of get my hands on. I hadn't heard of BYU studies, or I didn't know who Richard Bushman was, or I hadn't heard of farms or
Yeah.
fair. And had I have known, I probably would have gone searching. And I think I sort of felt like, man, I was taught like this certain narrative of the church, and had I have known more, maybe I wouldn't have gone on a mission or had the same
Hmm.
experiences. And really, if for me, if it wasn't for certain miracles and experiences that I had whenever I was out of the church, I probably wouldn't have came back. But I have a lot of empathy to those people who feel that betrayal and who feel
Yes, I
deceived
do too.
in that sense. And that's hard. And now I feel like the change has been since I've come back. I now feel like I want to research everything I can. I don't want there to be anything that I'm not
Yeah.
aware of. And I'm now aware of way more resources and studying research a lot more. And I feel like now, contrasting me with, say, my wife, she's not super interested in church history and all this stuff. I tell her stuff, but she's like, it's kind of interesting, but I just don't want to spend all my time and focus researching
Right.
and thinking about all these things. And I totally get that because it's like,
Would introduce our wives to each other.
yeah, it's like a never-ending pit in some ways. But then I feel in contrast, I'm like, well, if you don't learn about something, I tell you about it. I've told you all the resources. So in that
Yeah.
case, I feel like, you know, the responsibilities on her, the resources are there. But I maybe felt whenever I first encountered things, um, I didn't have access to the resources and felt that
Yeah.
betrayal. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I think there's a lot of people who have that similar experience to what I had as a
They
21,
do.
22-year-old, and my heart goes out to them.
Mine too. There are many people in that boat, or in variations on it, right? There's all kinds of variations to your story. And the thing that I love, um, when I hear you, is that you are not inconsistent, right? This is not, you haven't been different people over the years. You've always been the same person. That kid who longed for God at 14 and found him, and who read everything you could get your hands on, is the same kid who, in good conscience, said, I can't believe this anymore.
Yeah,
I can't, right? I've been, the things that I were sure were the lies of my enemies are now borne out by my friends. And I cannot, in good conscience, subscribe to this. So the same truth seeking, honest conscience 14-year-old is the 22-year-old as well. And it's the same person sitting here now, right? So it's not that you've become a different person. You haven't become an infidel from being a faithful person. Rather, you have gone on the path that Marie and Bruce Hafen said is the trajectory of life, right? You started in simplicity. You believed in simple truths and in ideals. And you found out that there were more facts than you knew about before. And that introduced you to complexity. You discovered that things were much more complex than you had been taught they were, and partly also that you had assumed that they were. And that's not something you did wrong. That's all you did was grow up and kept paying attention, right? Anybody who grows up and keeps paying attention is going to find that in every single area of their life, things are more complex than they knew at 5 or 14, right? It's going to be true in math. It's going to be true in relationships. It's going to be true in economics, art, everything. And it's certainly true in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ. And so you encountered the new facts, and it contributed to complexity. Complexity often is accompanied by that feeling of dissonance, this gap between what I believed and what I now know. And often there's a dissonance that comes with a gap between what I believe and how I behave. And for many people, teenagers and adults, it's very difficult to discern any difference, or it's hard to know which parts of the dissonance are a result of what factors, right? What's going on. It's very confusing, in other words, very complicated and difficult. We think we're rational creatures, but lots of different researchers from various angles have shown that we're more complex than that. We are bundles of emotions and other things that we explain to ourselves in rational ways, but the rationality is often after the fact rather than instead of it. We don't do things because we reasoned our way to it. We do things or think things or feel things and then tell ourselves a reasonable story, at least to our own satisfaction about it. Okay, so that's your experience and lots of other people's. And then what you did is you kept at it. You kept going. You didn't say, I'm going to quit right here. You said, I've always been a truth seeker. I am a truth seeker. I'm always going to be a truth seeker. And as you continued to seek for truth, you found even more facts that continued to complexify it. And
Yeah.
that meant that you could no longer accept the interpretations that you could accept when you knew more facts than when you were a kid, but less than when you were, right? The 25, 26-year old, whatever the case may be. So you're being true to the truth as you know it and as you have it. And you're continuing to seek it. And anyone who does what you're doing will come to the same results, the same conclusions. And it's the trajectory is fine. The roller coaster ride is okay. Sometimes we might think, no, you can't spend time outside the church or disaffected from it or whatever else. You can, okay? You can. Sometimes that's the right path. To be true to the truth as you know it, true to yourself. That's always right. Okay? You do the best you can with what you have, and you trust your loving heavenly parents to bring you along on their plan for your happiness. And as long as that's ultimately what you want, is their truth as it relates to you, you'll end up in the right place, the right time. And you and I have the job, besides working this out for ourselves, you and I have the job to love all of God's children and meet them wherever they are in this path and let them find their way while we love them, not try to force them to do it our way, but let them find their way. They're free agents as we are. We wouldn't want to be forced or cajoled or compelled or even mocked or whatever else. So I love the way you model for me and many others how this works. How do I seek for truth? How do I find it? How do I acknowledge it? Regardless, whether it's hard and discomforting or whether it's the most peaceful thing, because it's in at different places on the path, it's going to be all those things.
Yeah.
And you just do a great job of modeling it and then sharing your experience with others. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate those words. There's something you said that I think adds more complexity to this topic about, has the church hidden its history. You talked about as you dive deeper into some of these subjects, there's way more complexity. And
Yeah,
I think how I felt whenever I first left is I felt like the church is the liars. They've told me a whitewashed history, and everything I've now learned from the critics, the critical narrative, they're the truth tellers, and this is all there is to it. And as I've dived into certain topics, like one, for example, is the witnesses of the gold plates.
right.
Um, I remember, growing up in the church, I would have read the official testimony at the start of the Book of Mormon, three and the eight witnesses, and that would have been okay. That's their testimony. That's what they experienced. And then in documents like the CS letter or Mormon Think, or whenever I read through the Tanners or Grant Palmer, they showed a handful of quotes, most of them second or third hand, but from the witnesses that seemed problematic. I saw the plates as I see a city through a mountain, or I saw them with spiritual eyes, or the eye of faith, or the Stephen Burnett letter, and then
Right.
you're like, oh, their testimony is incredible. They didn't really see the plates. Why didn't I know about all these sources? And therefore, you're like, I'm gonna reinterpret the official testimony isn't reliable because of these sources. But then, as I continued to research, I encountered that there's way more sources and documents from the
Yeah,
three and the eight witnesses, as particularly a lot of primary statements.
yeah,
I think Richard Lloyd Anderson documented close to 200 or more, where they're emphatic over and over and over again. And I remember as an ex-Mormon reading through a lot of their statements and being like, oh no, like it didn't cause me to believe, but I realized for the first time, like, okay, the church is biased. I'm not gonna say the church isn't biased, but I
we'll
realized
grant that.
like here, but
Grant
then
that.
I was thinking that the critics are completely unbiased, and that's when I
Right.
realized there's way more complexity because now when I look at all of these faithful statements, the vast majority reaffirm and align with the official um, testimony. And if anything, I found it personally misleading that they were cherry picking that. And as I
Yes.
dived into more topics, I found that in some cases they're maybe just focusing on the information or the facts that can challenge faith,
Yeah.
and there's way more complexity to it. Now, I don't want to say all critics are like that. There's some critics who I think are really good, really sharp. I really like Dan Vogel and respect his work,
Hmm.
even though I might disagree with him on conclusions. But that was eye-opening to me that from diving deeper into these topics, there's more complexity. Or like, we did an interview on masonry and the temple endowment. And whenever I left the church, I was like, okay, I looked at all these similarities between masonry and the temple endowment. Okay, 7 weeks prior to the temple endowment, Joseph became a mason. He just stole it off from the masons. That's it, case closed. And it doesn't account for one, the dissimilarities, doesn't account for the line upon line sort of influences the years prior, or a lot of the ancient connections as well, and it just adds more complexity. And whenever I had a conversation with a friend who who just feels like the critics are right, they're the truth tellers, the church are the liars, I try to say like I just feel like there's more complexity to it, and there's more complexity to what the
Yeah.
critics say on a matter as well.
Man, that was so well said. That is exactly right. Uh, the the most vulnerable people to to stumbling on their search for truth are people who are not good yet. They will become good at identifying and then educating their cognitive distortions, one of which is emotional reasoning, thinking that my emotions are a guide to truth. Now, someone might say, yeah, that's why you can't trust the Holy Spirit. No, that's not exactly right. You can't trust your rationality either, right? In other words, the best way to do this is by triangulating and combining your rational faculties and your spiritual faculties. That's what the scriptures prescribe always, is mind and heart, spirit and intellect,
Right.
right? Uh, so uh, so emotional reasoning is what black and white thinking. It's all or nothing. Either the church says everything true and nothing that isn't, and the critics are liars through and through, or the other way around. Well, neither one of those things is accurate.
Yeah.
One of those things works. And so the more we educate our biases, including the distortions we tell ourselves, the better at truth seeking we'll be, including the better at discerning what other people are telling us, which parts of it are right and true and accurate, which parts of it are not. And always, it's really important to think about how things are connected, right? What's at stake? If you prove that Joseph Smith had flaws, you haven't proved that Jesus is not the Son of God, resurrected from the dead, and called Joseph Smith as his prophet. So it's really important to not overstate what things mean, right? Um, uh, what we could think of 100 examples, right? There are things in the Book of Mormon that are in the King James Bible that Joseph Smith revised in his new translation of the Bible. Those are all facts. Now, if I decided that those facts mean that either Joseph Smith didn't translate the Book of Mormon by divine means, or the new translation wasn't inspired, or whatever else, now I'm reading meaning into the facts that's not inherent in them. And many people do not discern the difference between their endowing the facts with meaning and the
Right.
facts themselves. This is a really important skill. It's important to know when other people are doing that, and it's important to catch ourselves doing it. And what we want to do is then interrogate that process. Is that the right meaning? Does it account best for all the facts? Uh,
Is it the only
interpret,
interpretation one can
yeah,
draw from it?
interpretations are like shoes. You try them on and you make sure they fit. You test them out. You don't just take as a given anyone's interpretation and trust it the same with the same value of meaning as the facts of the matter themselves. But it's not that we don't teach these skills very well, and not many people inherently have them. So we could do a much better job. And I mean, we just generally, as human beings, as well as church people, we could do a much better job of teaching each other these skills and helping practice them. And so that's what you're doing. I'm grateful for it.
Thank you. One listener brought up, what's your thoughts on the seer stone? So this is one specific one. We already talked
Yeah.
about the first vision, but what's your thoughts on the seer stone? Because often in art or in church movies, the depiction is, Joseph translating, looking at the gold plates. I'd obviously read about the breastplate and the Urim and Thummim, but I didn't really think about even that being utilized in the translation
Yeah.
because of the way I viewed it in art, and very much the sort of like the correlated narrative that we were generally taught was the canonized narrative of the Urim and Thummim with the plates, and people feel that the church hid the seer stone, and then in 2015 it brought the seer stone out from the vault and
Yeah.
publicized it to the world. You've got essay on the seer stone. What's your thoughts on? Because I think this is also really nuanced as well, about the church has just hidden the seer stone, and then again with the internet has now sort of changed the narrative on the Book of Mormon translation.
Well, I think it's way more complex than just that. But in general, I would be willing to grant that, right? As a 30,000-foot view, yeah, the church didn't talk as much about the seer stone as it could have. It did publish an article in the Friend magazine in the early
Yeah,
70s,
that's right.
frankly acknowledging it.
I think
It's
there was
not
also a
like,
statement from President Nelson as well. I don't know if it was the same magazine.
yeah. So it's not like nobody knows about it. It's not like it was hidden at all costs. Like, you'd be summarily executed if you were a church member and you mentioned the seer stone, or if you were a church leader. So is that you can't say with any kind of credibility, everyone in church leadership from the top down conspired to hide the seer stone from all members of the church. That's a falsehood. But I think it is accurate to say that generally speaking, leaders and members of the church don't know about seer stones and they don't talk about them until we begin to get more knowledge. It's not just the advent of the information age, it's not just the advent of the internet, it's the whole accessibility of information. I said that stupidly, right? sounded so. There you go. I'm stupid, but it is the information age. It's the accessibility of information, not
Right.
just the internet, right? There's been a 500-year or not industrial, but a information revolution now,
Right.
and we're on an edge of it where it's much easier to access information now than it ever was. So the fact that uh, there was some article in the Friend magazine in the early 70s, well, yeah, that circulated to a limited number of people, and a tiny number of them read it, and a tiny number of them remembered it. So you could shout it from the housetops, and that doesn't mean that anybody's going to know. Well, with the advent of the internet, that exact same information becomes much more available, much more accessible. And so this is a time for everybody to start saying, "Oh, wow, there's information there that I've got to account for all of a sudden." And of course, one of the things the church does is figure out, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do about that? And in some ways, the church is quite slow moving on those things, right? We're not going to do anything about it. We're going to let the Book of Mormon talk for itself, speak for itself, make its own powerful witness. And eventually we realize, yeah, we better account for these facts. We've got so many members who are now newly aware of these things. They're asking us questions. Let's provide some resources that could help answer those questions. So I'll grant this narrative in general that the church sort of didn't talk about this information and then has changed its mind on that. Okay, I'm perfectly fine with that. So has the rest of the world, right? That's exactly what we've all done in the last 50 years.
Right.
All right. So, and if you're asking, what do I think about the seer stone in terms of did Joseph Smith use a stone prepared by God or two together with the two stones Moroni revealed to translate the Book of Mormon? I believe he did. I believe the historical record is thick enough. I don't have all the details. There are many people who think uh, or who say, by the way they write about it, they seem to know more about exactly what parts Joseph translates in what way than I do.
Mm.
I'm, I'm interested in the argument being made pretty forcefully that you can only trust Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. They're the only ones who really know, and they only say Urim and Thummim are interpreters, and so there is no seer stone involved, and so forth. Okay, I'm interested in listening to that argument, weighing it, assessing it. But at the end of the day, for me, I think there's too much volume and quality in the evidence from Emma, Martin, David, et cetera,
Yeah.
that I think there is a seer stone involved, and that's okay, perfectly fine with me. I take Alma 37:23 as a possible prophecy of this in the Savior's
Definitely.
voice. Yeah, I'll prepare my servant as stone that will shine forth in darkness unto light. I mean, I like to tell my students the translation of the Book of Mormon works the same way as translation in the Book of Mormon. And you find half a dozen passages that back you up. I'm really not concerned at the end of the day about the number of stones Joseph uses or where he gets them and so forth. The Book of Mormon was translated by the power of God. And I think we're making a mistake if we overemphasize exactly which stone or stones was used on which day to translate which passage,
Right.
and don't and maybe miss the mark of the book itself. I think that's what Joseph would encourage us to say. He did not spend a lot of time elaborating on how he translated it. He spent his time on emphasizing this book is a translator by the power of God. It's true.
No, I love that. I'm resonate with that. And David Snell, I thought, did a really good video as well on was the seer stone covered up, and I've done my own research on it. And again, I think it's
Yeah.
very nuanced because Joseph and Oliver primarily in their accounts talk about the Urim and Thummim or the Nephite interpreters, and then a lot of the accounts about a seer stone in a hat, some of them come from Emma or David or Martin, sort of decades later. But then what was interesting to learn was that whenever, the seer stone accounts were known sort of towards the end of the 19th century, that it was sort of embraced by church leaders at the time. I think there was a statement from Brigham Young and President Snow and even B.H. Roberts in the Comprehensive History of the Church talked
Yep.
about a seer stone in the early 1900s. And then something that's maybe a possible shift in the narrative, I'm interpreting here, but I think Joseph Fielding Smith gave a statement about he acknowledged that Joseph had a seer stone and he acknowledged these seer stone accounts, but he saw them as probably not very credible, hearsay or erroneous, and frankly, he believed Joseph and Oliver and saw them kind of in conflict. And then
Yeah.
after that, it seems very much that the Urim and Thummim narrative is what was emphasized. And I sort
Right.
of see there's a lot more nuance to it. Like, I don't see it as like, first of all, it seems like the Seer Stone was sort of embraced or accepted along with the Urim and Thummim in the
Yeah.
late 19th century, early 20th century. And then it seems like I don't think Joseph Fielding Smith was intentionally covering it up, but saying he just didn't buy the Seer Stone accounts. And when it comes to the Urim Thumb versus Seer Stone, I read a book by Jonathan Neville and James Lucas who were like, no, very much
Me
the Urim
too.
and Thummim. So then
Yeah, me
I
too.
was like, you know what? I'm gonna go and I'm just gonna read all the statements I can on it just to figure it out. Opening the Heavens had a great chapter on it, so I was just
Yeah.
going through all the ones that talk about Urim and Thummim and Seer Stone, and then I made a video on it. And I came to a similar conclusion as you. I believe that there were spectacles or Nephite interpreters used in the translation and a seer stone. Some accounts talk about Urim and Thummim, some talk about Urim and Thummim in a hat. I found a couple of secondhand accounts from Oliver and Joseph telling someone about the translation about spectacles in a hat. So I thought, well, maybe there could be a conflation, or maybe both instruments were used. And I came to the same conclusion. I can't really determine which was used when, but most likely I interpret it as likely both were utilized. But I think there's a lot more complexity to the history that I feel like I understand more about it, and I don't feel like it's as simple as to say the church intentionally hid the seer stone, because if you look at across the history, it's been emphasized at times and then sort of
Yeah.
de-emphasized at times. And now, as historians have re-examined it, it's like, no, there's credibility to the seer stone in a hat accounts.
You just did a brilliant, brilliant job of that. You rejected cognitive distortions. You didn't give us a linear, this is how it went, right? You gave us a roller coaster ride of history, accounted for the complexity in the historical record. You didn't make anyone the bad guy and the other person the good guy. You did a great, you could teach my class, man. That
Oh,
was fantastic.
oh, thanks. All credit
That's,
to David Snell.
well, and yourself, that's what being a truth seeker does for you. It gives you that capacity. You've got mastery of the facts. You know what questions are still unanswered. You don't pretend to know things you don't know, right? You are a real great model of what it looks like to seek the truth. And
I
I
appreciate
just
that.
really love that. And I'm grateful for the good work you're doing.
Oh, you're too kind. Well, I'll finish with like a last couple of questions. I guess one point that came to my mind, sort of like on what we talked about previously about more complexity when you dive in to some of these
Uh-huh.
topics, because I feel like this world of so shall we say scholarship, you've got like BYU studies and interpreter, and you've got like farms, and then Fair Mormon, and then you've got critics and their podcast. It almost seems like a separate world to like the average Latter-day Saint. There's like
Oh, it
whenever I
is.
first encountered it, I was like, there's this whole new world. And I remember when I talked with David Snell prior to him starting the Faith and Beliefs videos, he didn't know really much about any of these controversies, and he was like, "I'm exposed to this brand new world." And it seems like the average member of the church isn't probably aware of a lot of these things. But the point I was going to make is I find as I've been doing more research and things that you also encounter some positive evidence either in church history or things to do with the Book of Mormon. We talked about the witnesses. I find like the Book of Enoch fascinating, and I've done episodes on like connections to ancient temple rituals, and I've had Jeff Bradshaw on, and lots of things that I've learned, which you might see as like positive evidence or faith promoting,
Sure.
that I also didn't learn from the church as
Yeah.
well. No, I
Hey,
wouldn't make the argument the church has intentionally hidden it from me. Why would it intentionally hide some of these faith promoting things? But maybe it's a little bit of a realization that I totally get those people who feel frustration that the church maybe wasn't fully forthright about some of these controversial things, like with polygamy or seer stones or the first vision accounts. But I don't think the church's primary function, its primary mission, is to dive in deeply into all these church history topics and criticisms and apologetics. Like its
No,
primary focus is to teach the gospel, for us disciples
right.
to become like Jesus Christ. And I'm grateful in a way, and I'm sure you're the same for someone who studies so much into church history, that your Sunday service is kind of very much focused on the gospel and Christ and all those things. But it's recognizing that a lot of these positive things that we learn from deeper research into scholarship or apologetics, also, I had never heard of any of these things from the church either growing up.
Yeah, that's really well said. Really well said. Just yesterday, I was privy to a report of a research study. The church has a research and information division, and they are expert researchers, and they study and gather data of all kinds and analyze it in sophisticated ways. And that and earlier uh, similar experiences bear out exactly what you're saying. Most Latter-day Saints do not know about or care about all of the scholarship on all these related issues, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
You can lay hold on eternal life through Jesus Christ and never know about all this stuff. That's no problem. But for those who do need it and want it, it is there. And there's a lot of great resources. And I'm glad that both of those things are true.
Absolutely. Well, final question or so here. I talked with the man the other week on the phone who has gone through a faith crisis, and he's left the church, and he was very faithful, very devout, served in, sort of high positions, bishoprics, stake presidencies, temple presidencies. Him and his wife went on missions. Like he was, the sort of person where like he would never leave the church. And I knew him growing up. I was in his ward, and he has load of issues. And I could on the phone we were talking. There was obviously a lot of cynicism. There's a lot of frustration, bit of venting, and he was sharing a lot of his issues. I was sharing my perspective and trying to give some explanation and sharing my story. But at the end of the call, I could really tell underneath all of his frustration, this betrayal. And he said to me, I feel
Yeah.
like I've given my life to the church and I feel so betrayed. And also around the same time as if his wife passed while he was in this faith crisis. And
Yeah.
I just felt so bad for the man. I'm like, I can tell he's in so much pain. And I felt really sad for him. And like, what would you say to someone who feels that way, who feels this betrayal, who feels this loss of faith, who feels like I don't know how I could believe again, or feel like I could come back to the church. And it's not from him. I don't think it was really out of rebellion, but they feel like they just feel that betrayal and feel deceived. And I guess what would you say to someone
Yeah.
who's in that situation?
You know, uh, I could learn from him. I don't know what he feels. I haven't had that kind of loss, and I haven't ever felt that sense of betrayal at that level.
Yeah.
So, what I would want to know from him is tell me, right? Help me understand what this is like. Help me understand your experience. And I want him to know I love him. And I want him to know that God loves him. That nothing in his experience has changed that. It might feel like it, right? It might feel like he's utterly forsaken. He might feel like Joseph Smith in that pit in Liberty, Missouri, where he says, "Oh God, where are you? And how long is this going to go on?" If you were there, is a variation on that. Why am I suffering these things? Why this sense of being utterly betrayed, and why this devastating loss? Um, and my conviction is that God loves us in the midst of those losses and in the midst of that suffering. In fact, that God embodies that suffering. The Latter day Saints don't, our theodicy or our resolution to the problem of suffering isn't that God, if he loved us, would take away suffering. It's that God loved us so much that he suffered, right?
Right.
Uh, God suffers. That's the Father and the Son, both. And they can fathom our suffering, and they can succor us in our suffering, and they can heal us of our woundedness and our sense of being betrayed. I mean, Jesus was betrayed. And so the ultimate person who can help your friend is Jesus Christ. And I trust that he will. I trust that he will help and bless, and I hope and pray that there will be comfort and healing from that sense of betrayal. People who've been betrayed, I don't know the depth of that feeling, but Jesus does, and he can help them and help uh, heal those wounds.
That's beautiful. I've got one last question, then
It's
I'm gonna let you go. Uh,
less, it's less about facts
hmm,
than it's about the wounds that we have and the healing that we seek.
yeah. One last question, then I'll let you go because I don't want to take too much more time of your day. And sorry, listeners, I've not been able to ask every single question today, but I think I think it's been a really good and important discussion, and I hope this might help some people. Like you've spent your career, pretty much your life, writing, researching, teaching church history. You've got great expertise in the first vision accounts of Joseph Smith, the revelations of the prophet Joseph Smith, and you're aware of all of these either historical issues or controversies as well as some faith promoting things in church history. I guess how has your study of church history impacted your help both your knowledge but impacted your
Yeah.
faith, and how do you still remain a strong believer in the restoration and the truth claims of the church, knowing all of these historical controversies or issues?
For me, it works in the opposite direction. For me, faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and in his restored gospel preceded any interest in church history. I study church history because I want to know the truth, primarily the truth about God, Christ, and myself. Who am I and how do I relate to them? Where did I come from? What am I doing here? Do I have a future after this? And I really, really, really want to know if that future involves being sealed to Jenny Sebring for all eternity. And the restored gospel of Jesus Christ that Joseph Smith taught tells me it does, based on the terms and conditions of the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. That's right. So I, I'm a Christian. I'm a convicted Christian in both the sense of convicted of my sins and absolutely convicted in my my heart and mind of the truthfulness of the Christian gospel. And of all the Christian gospels, the restored version of it that Joseph Smith gives me is the best. It's the most complete. It's the loveliest of all. And so I cherish it. I treasure it. And because I do, I study it. I study it as much as I can and in every way I can. My my tools are the tools of a historian, but I'm interested in every possible way of knowing truth that there is. I'm glad to know anything science can teach me, anything psychology can teach me, anything art can teach me. I want to become a great revelator above all. I want to commune with God. Um, and so I study revelators, right? How does revelation work? That's what I really want is to know God and Christ whom he has sent. And all of the homework is just loving God with my mind as best I can in my very flawed condition as I am now. So I don't study the history of the church or the history of Christianity or the scriptures because I lack faith and I'm hoping to shore it up. I study all those things because I have faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and the restoration of his gospel, and I want to know him. I need to know God and Christ. I want to know everything about them that I possibly can. So for me, it goes that direction, not the other one.
That's awesome. Well, Steve Harper, thank you so much for coming on today and having this discussion and for all your wisdom and insights and
Thank
particularly
you.
your thoughtfulness, not just all the things you know in your mind, but also your heart. as well, and I've loved all of our conversations. And listeners who've been watching, if you've enjoyed this as well, comment, and share. Don't forget to subscribe. And we put in some resources where you can check out some of Steve's work that he's doing. He's also got a channel with Easton. It's called Studying Faith. No,
That's right.
And you bring on different people that you interview, and you're sort of responding to things in the CS letter, which is important. I think it's a great podcast. I've listened to quite a few episodes, so people.
And you've been featured on it.
That's right. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
It's great to be with you again. Thank you. Thanks for all you're doing. Bless you.
You too, Steve. We'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.